I did undergraduate in a program called Media Arts in Melbourne, and it's a very broad term that I guess in the late 90s there was this really hard task of trying to talk about digital media in the arts and then trying to teach it. And I guess that's something I've been trying to working out for my whole career, is at what point does it matter what software or sort of medium you actually work in? And perhaps it does. So I actually entered into a course that was full of fine art photographers and sound designers. And I desperately wanted to not touch anything or take any photographs or touch anybody or talk to anybody. All I wanted to do was kind of build little environments on the computer. I guess in a sense I was probably one of the first students who'd entered the university who had done all of their work with a mouse and a keyboard. So 1997, 98. And that would be common to some of the staff here, but now it's pretty commonplace. But at that time, most people were producing work through interactions with people, photographing something in the real world and then digitizing it. But I've been building very, 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 very simple environments on the computer in 3D software under much duress, like it wasn't easy. And I was desperate to communicate with the other students there about how to create environments with the work. So I was concerned with how to communicate the worlds that I'd been building in this digital environment, how to produce images of them that would actually relate to photographers. Because if you can imagine a whole bunch of people doing work about their parents being immigrants and their relationship with their father, and then me getting up there and saying, I really like 3D modeling, it didn't quite work. So I was aware that I had to find some way to engage people in this world that I had been building for myself. So I started to build like triptychs, so sets of 3. Again, the language that you learn hanging around with different people who make different mediums, you know, the triptych. And I began to realize that the common thing that I could play around with as a kind of textural like idea in 3D, in this digital realm, was light and volumetric lighting. So I started to create really, really simple pieces that just created a kind of dynamic with the viewer, that were just like an object in front of a light and you sort of stand there, and I play with that as much as I could. Really similar to playing with little set pieces, little models or big models in a kind of theatrical kind of makeup, if you like. So I started thinking about what the hell I'm doing using metaphors, like, am I making models and photographing them, or am I playing with a theatre set, something like that. So the way to engage people was to talk about the work as if it was my little theatre, my little model set. And some of the results of playing around with that worked really well. These were all presented as large photographic prints, which was also a technology that was becoming more and more available. This idea that I could take digital data, red, green and blue light, but expose photographic paper to it, gave me like this ability for my work to look like photographs. That's now commonplace, that you do the same thing when you go down to get your photos done. But at that time, the idea of taking a file to the camera store and blowing up a huge print was sort of new and sort of evolving, because you'd get inkjet prints done. So I started creating sort of simple video versions of the environments, as if they were sort of alive. And reinvigorated that triptych idea. The first major show that I got after leaving university was in a heritage-listed site in the middle of Melbourne. And I wanted this clean, cold kind of gallery, and I had this idea that what I was going to do was take scenes from movies and remake them in 3D, but instead of just remaking them and printing images of them, which would seem no point, I would take a whole bunch of different perspectives on that scene, and then I would create a kind of a sculpture, if you like, of all the shots of my imaginary little world. And so I made this 20-minute video and built into the heritage structure, which already had this ugly window there. I built what looked like, if you've been to an altarpiece, so at the top of a Catholic cathedral, you'd have the story of of kind of Christ displayed on these fold-out kind of altar pieces. So I sort of built one into the wall like that, almost just one element to the practice was about sort of constructing ways to see 3D content in a space. Right? Pretty simple. Divide up the space, project out into it, get people to walk through it. Right? The other element that was also sort of tied into what was happening at the time in terms of technology was performance. So it was actually taking a whole lot of found footage, stuff that I'd been interested in. So I'd been taking little scenes from movies and then trying to recreate them in 3D because they look like the sets that I'd been talking about. The other thing that I would do would be to take all of those pieces of footage and not remake them, but to use them as triggerable points in performance. So I'd work with a musician and we'd actually re-edit by triggering these sort of clips on and off, these sort of large performances. So we might say take a collection of every single scene set in a cemetery, and then we'd edit between the shots and someone would play live music. And that would give us sort of ideas about how, and you see this is just a 4-screen view, and there's a sort of sound designer there and me standing at the back. But that would give us new ideas about how to combine things, but also about the effect of holding on a shot in a film, like just taking it out of a film and leaving it on. And this is fairly crude. You know, it was laptop-based, but sometimes we just go in with a VHS, maybe 2, and like slow them down or mix between the two. You could mix with a big vision mixer. And if we were clever enough about it, we didn't need much technology. So that was, I guess things is kind of divided into three parts. What I was trying to do as an undergrad was make pictures, make images, make 3D kind of worlds. And rather than, I guess, developing things that looked ultra real, I was just concerned with like communicating, much more like a graphic artist. I didn't really care if people could experience them literally. I was more concerned with the visceral experience. What were you going to sort of feel by entering the works? And when you graduate, you've either got to go get a job or you've got to start communicating about your projects that you want to do beyond that point. And I'd sort of sit down with people and I'd talk about this idea of creating worlds and then moving people through those worlds. And it doesn't matter, sometimes it was arts organisations, sometimes it was galleries, sometimes it was to getting into courses at university. You'd have these conversations. What the hell are you doing? Like, what are you actually making and who cares? Because people, you know, it's very easy to say my work is about this or this, but when you want to make experiences, you've got to be articulate about it. So the same in gaming, I guess. You know, what is the game about? And what kept popping up was this idea that perhaps what I was trying to create in my work was a sort of a ghost train or a haunted house. And the more that I thought about that metaphor, it sort of worked. I'd sort of take a whole bunch of stuff that everybody knew, like shots from films and spooky shots and misty bits and this and that, and then very, very crudely, I'd put them back together in a kind of story. But I really wanted people to walk through the story, maybe because I was too lazy to create proper animations. But I liked projecting and I liked smoke machines and things like this. So I started to do research about the history of ghost trains and haunted houses. And I did this both because you study at university and I went on to do a master's degree. You do it because you want to come up with ideas for pictures. That's the simple thing. Whether you're a graphics student or a game student or an animation student, you don't research things just for an assignment. But it worked in many ways and made the work interesting and allowed me to talk about it. So I found that at the turn of the century in America, ghost trains, haunted houses, were called dark rides because they were indoors. Because for the first time you could actually create a ride where you could control the sound and the light. And this happened at a very specific time in history because of the use of electricity and electric trams and trolley cars. So the same trams you have here, that technology sort of started to pop up in America, and it meant that there were heaps more technology that was very, very quiet because they were electric-driven motors rather than petrol-driven motors. So if you think about a fairground or an amusement park, before the turn of the last century, so before the 20th century, so in the 1800s, there were huge fairgrounds everywhere, but everything at the fairground was powered by petrol. And everything was huge and mechanical and very noisy. And then all of a sudden, in the 1910s, the rides started changing because you could make them quieter and you could run little tracks through darkened kind of spaces. Now, you might say, who cares? I don't care. But it helps us to understand the way that cinema would then evolve and the way that we'd actually see images by understanding the way that people actually engaged with like popular entertainment. And it seemed like not a lot had been written about these dark rides. So we call them dark rides because it's anything in the dark, right? It could be a walkthrough or it could be something where you get on a cart. The point was that there seemed to be this interesting phenomenon and this new media that had existed 110 years ago that we know about. Like it's in every movie and you've been on a ghost train, but it didn't seem to be written about, not as an important medium. And yet it was the first time that anybody had told a story with electricity, right, and a sequence, right, consistently. So much like turning on a computer game or playing a film, these rides existed in a way that was repeated for every single user, right? But there wasn't any electrical entertainment like that. You know, you could read a book or you could go to a play, but these existed before cinema, right? So all the iconography and all the stuff that they must have been using in these rides 110 years ago must have come from stories and books and not from films, whereas everything else that we look at, we know about cinema. So when you build a game or do a piece of graphics, you know about ghosts and Frankenstein because you've seen a picture of them or you've seen them in the cinema. So anyway, I was really, really interested in that idea that somewhere in here in history there was like an example of a way to build a narrative, build a story in a space in the dark. So I started taking these images that I found that also looked amazing and just stealing them and ripping them apart and building my own sort of facades, almost as a way to sort of try and get engaged, try and get into that space. So sometimes my work is just illustrations, just pulling bits of stuff here and there. And sometimes it's about building spaces. So I built this set of sort of images that became prints, large prints, very like 2.5 meters long, so bigger than this screen. So you'd walk up to them and they'd really wrap around you. And so these were exhibited in a public sort of site. And then I sort of went on to take the photographs that I'd found in books and on the internet and I'd build them into images. They're a bit dim here, but you know. Sort of fascinating stuff. And it's all very early last century and it's all before all of the big rides and the big horror films. It's before Dracula becomes a cinematic idea. These rides existed. So I just used them to build these images. And you can see they're kind of a crude 3D. 3D just becomes a way for me to locate a shape spatially. And they became large prints, large black rectangles in a gallery. So, again, research comes in kind of waves. You make a couple of pictures and then you go off and you find some more stuff and then you make some pictures. It's easy when you're a photographer to understand because you go and find the subject, then you shoot it and you think about it and you go back. I guess I approach it in the same way. So you study, who you study with affects the way that you work, but you should always be looking for new ways to work. But I knew that if I went and found the sites, I would get new inspiration, new elements would pop up. So I went to this is one of 8 sites that I went to in 2007 on a tour specifically to experience some of these existing early rides, so like the first rides that existed. So this was a park on the outskirts of Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania, just near, you know, I guess near the border of Canada-ish, kind of top of Pennsylvania. It's your sort of classic America, classic northeastern America, very bushy and green. You could imagine being chased through the hills by a kind of chainsaw wielding kind of guy, but it's not dry, it's quite luscious. Mistakenly, I booked a hotel on the outskirts of town, like really far out, and I saw where this park was. And I found myself kind of catching a bus through one of what I've later found out to be like the most depressed and sometimes just kind of derelict areas of Pittsburgh. Akin to what you might have heard or read about Detroit, completely abandoned areas of a city. And then you get to this park. It's all beautifully kind of put together, with lovely sort of stuff. And I went there to see one particular ride that was 110 years old and ride on it. But I guess what I found on the way were strange sort of things. I kept thinking and seeing signs to different suburbs in the area and thinking that's strange because nothing is around here, yet I've heard the name of this suburb, West Mifflin. Anyway, in the early 70s, George Romero shot the first of the Dawn of the Dead sort of quadrilogy now. So one of the most famous zombie films, he's set in exactly this area at a time when it had just began to become depressed. And I started to see these really weird connections between, like, the way that they designed these rides with all these sort of planks and boarded up areas and spooky houses, the way that it actually looked, and then the way that people were making up narratives in popular sort of cinema and TV. So there was this connection between where a ride was and what it was saying about the space around it. So in America, and it actually turned out that here is the park, and inside the park just here is a 100-year-old ride called the Old Mill. So the Old Mill is it's a ride where you get in a little boat, and I'll show you much later. You get in a little boat and you ride through this old mill, and everybody cackles, and there's spooky things in the old mill. And you can think of a million of these different like mythological spaces, the abandoned toxic waste dump, the old crotchety witch woman at the end of the street. You can think of like heaps of different places from films, right? So the Old Mill is one of them. But what's interesting about Pittsburgh and a lot of these sites is that right down here is an abandoned mill. And that's been abandoned for the same amount of time that the ride has existed. And if you walk through the suburbs, all you see are these boarded up houses. The same kind of houses that in reality are boarded up because people have had to move because the old mill shut down, but are used throughout cinema in the same way where, like zombies are attacking, we've got to board the house up. So, traveling to places gives you this other sort of sense of what's important and what's actually happening. Why do things look the way they do? And the interesting thing about America is that they don't keep things, right? So they just let things fall apart. The only way you can find out about the history of America is by looking at their popular entertainment. So if you want to find out what used to happen, just look at who the villains are in a movie, and you'll figure out what the space that you're standing in might used to have been. So I started making work with these sort of planks and overgrown sort of work. It just became the texture of the work. I would look for abandoned sort of sites. I guess it's almost a cliche to look at abandoned amusement park sites. But again, it's a big sort of metaphor when it comes to America. But this is a Japanese park. There's a bunch of them in Japan. This is a completely abandoned island with a bunch of these rides. I didn't go there, but I used the image to make one of my illustrations. I decided to start building some more distinct structures. But if you can imagine, there's a park, and I rebuilt the illustration similar to this in reality. as a giant piece of perspex. So I had prints, adhesed, and you could actually walk underneath it, and kids would sort of cycle down the street and then try and duck under it. It was quite good. Parallel to these darker rides, there were these sort of like gaudy kinds of sort of facades that kept being built into things. So they weren't subtle and neon, and they were from all the way throughout last century. But the thing that was interesting to me is that certain stories kept being used in ghost trains. So it wasn't just spooky this or spooky that. There were actual narratives, stories that were getting told through the ride itself. And the one that was the most common is Dantes Inferno, the classic piece of early Italian literature. Over and over again, there were these different sort of images of Dante or the devil, and this idea of a descent into hell. And I thought, that's interesting. So I went back to some of the places I'd visited in Europe as a child, and one really cool fresco that I'd seen in the middle of Italy as a kid, that for obvious reasons you would love as a kid, because it's like the devil eating someone and then pooing him out and then eating him again. And these sort of ideas come up in Christian mythology all the time, that the actual idea of going to hell is like being digested. And if you're a Star Wars fan, it's the same idea. Hell is getting swallowed up and then going through the levels of hell. And there's theory, but we can go there some other time, that rides are a bit like traveling through a passage, being digested. So it works perfectly. So I went about taking this image, which had not haunted me, I just loved it as a kid, 11, 12, okay with violence, but he's fascinated by it. So this was huge. San Gimignano, middle of Tuscany, go there. So I started kind of trying to work this into kind of design. So I started throwing a couple of stills about how I actually kind of work. You can see it's fairly simple, dumb, if you like. It's just about sort of taking the image and then kind of building it into form and shape. And then that became a large, shitty still, installation that wrapped around a building down by the side of a kind of highway. So I've done a bit of this and a bit of that. I'm sort of grabbing bits from here and there. And it's funny, when you get a bit of a practice and a bit of research and you can communicate about what you want to do, you find yourself in interesting situations. Someone says to you, oh, I run a museum about magic in Melbourne. And I'm like, oh, I have an idea. I've been looking at illusion and about early cinema, and I'd found this effect that is crucial to the sort of early days of cinema, and it's called the Pepper's Ghost. If you've seen The Illusionist, they use this effect in The Illusionist with Edward Norton. And it was a way to get an image of someone look ghostly on a stage. Very, very simple. Put a bit of glass, put it on an angle, project something, bounce it off the glass. So it's the same as, when you're looking through a dark window in the middle of the night, you see yourself in reflection, except that if you get the angles right, from a distance, you can make it look like someone is see-through. If you've been to Disneyland or any of the big places, they use this effect to this day. They just angle a bit of glass, get you in the right position so you can't look around it, and then they project from another angle. So it makes things look like a hologram or an apparition. So I said, okay, cool, I've got this idea. Well, I went to San Francisco and I found these beautiful fortune tellers. Yep. The only way I can, if you haven't seen one and you haven't seen the movie Big with Tom Hanks, and I've got nothing, but if you watched Big with Tom Hanks, he makes a wish that he could be an adult, and it's a very similar machine. Anyway, they had heaps of these around the turn of the century. So I rebuilt one in 3D. My sort of technique with 3D is to focus on fabric, because it makes my illustrations look realer. That's what I do, and then the rest I kind of fill in. So I built that, and then what we actually did was we did that same idea. I put an LCD TV in a box, we put a curtain around it, and this was the opening of this particular exhibit about magic. And so you entered, and this apparition in a box just sort of floated there. It's great. And she'd sort of turn into smoke and then turn back into apparition. So you can get a sense that you have this practice, right? And you sort of make work wherever you can, 3D, graphics, photos, whatever. And then you try and keep giving yourself ideas. So travel, Norway, America, wherever it might be. I was trying to think of a way to build a new installation, and so during my trip I looked at places and spaces, you know, mills and old things and decrepit things and McDonald's that were shut down and stuff like that. But I also looked specifically at the rides, trying to get an idea of how they're made up, how they're actually structured. And could I use any of those ideas to build installations? And I found this reoccurring idea, which is a really basic, simple idea, which is that you get people to walk through a space and then you spin all the walls around them, like so. The idea being that they stand on a plank, if you like. In this case, it was a pirate ride, so you stood on a plank. And then a big barrel, which were the walls, would rotate. And all this was a big tin can with holes in it and a neon light on the other side. But it worked fantastically. I mean, we've got Oculus Rift now, so you can spin people around dead easy, right? But as far as something that you can maybe walk through, I thought this would be a really good idea. And it came up a couple of times. So pirate rides, all the time. You'd always use this technique, spin the room around. But also in Noah's Ark rides. So in a Noah's Ark ride, you get in the Ark. I mean, I don't know why anybody would think that a Noah's Ark ride is scary, but I guess you've got to be really close to the donkeys, and I don't know. But it was made to be like a dark ride, right? So it was all about sort of just playing around with your senses. And I don't know, I haven't seen the Russell Crowe movie yet, but I guess that'll be pretty horrible. So there's a reason. But these were much better constructed. You'd walk in and everything would look still. And you'd be like, and you wouldn't notice that you're on a kind of one floor and the walls are on a different floor. And then suddenly they just spin and you lose your shit. Vertigo. You'd get vertigo or lose your shit, as they say. So the room could spin around quite a lot. In Disneyland, if you ever get a chance to go there, and I would, any kind of practitioner, any kind of person dealing with space and time and anything like that, you've got to go to Disneyland, and you've got to spend a lot of time there. But there's one ride that's particularly strange and relates to a whole lot of stuff that I was interested in, and that is the largest dark ride in the world, which is Space Mountain. So, who's been on Space Mountain? Anybody? Disneyland? Anybody? Yeah, it's good, isn't it? Like it's horrible. It's hot. Well, okay. But yeah, horrible good. The idea is that like a dark ride isn't about ghosts or spectres or something. It's about screwing around with where you think you are located through light. And that's the same as when you get someone in a cinema. You change their perspective, their point of view. When you're on a Ferris wheel, the best you can do is take someone up really high and bring them back down. Move them around without their knowing it. But when you are on a Dodgem car or a Ferris wheel or a loop-the-loop, you know where you are. You give over to the machine. When you go to the cinema, you're in your own space, you know where you are, but you don't know what's going to happen. And that idea of dragging someone through a space came from dark rides. In Space Mountain, all they use is neon strips. And what they do is it's a roller coaster that's indoors, and they just rotate neon strips past you, around you. So it's like you're constantly in light speed or warp speed. Somebody got a picture of Space Mountain with the lights on because something went wrong and they had to turn the lights on. But you normally cannot see anything. So this is the roller coaster. And around the roller coaster are like lights and all sorts of LEDs. So it's this hybrid kind of experience. It's really, really interesting. And I just started thinking about tubes. This is from Event Horizon. Yeah. It's good to know. Which is a beautifully designed kind of film. I was really interested in that tube and what it might feel like to go inside it. But I thought, from a projection point of view, that could be quite easy. So I built this sort of space that I'll show you in just a second. I used the entranceway that I built in the park, and I used 3 projectors to project around the person as they walk through the tube. the idea being that you can control someone completely without having to make an entire room. You just put them inside the tube. And it created a really, really large work using sort of projection screen like this, but 4 meters by sort of 7 meters of this projection screen. So enough to kind of cover any kind of group of people. We could sort of wrap it around most of us right now. And developing sort of animated content for a screen that's wrapped around is quite interesting, because you can change the way that the elements that you've built in, say, After Effects and 3D, that the way they relate to somebody in terms of different environments. So at first I made a tube that you walk through long ways, and then I redesigned it to be a tube that you actually sat inside. So I could create this idea of like descending into hell long ways, or I could change the elements around and have them so that they affected people up and down. So I've got more stills of this than I do of the other, but I changed the nature of the installation quite a bit. When I took some stuff and made the demons kind of go up and down and round. But that is the nature of digital kind of content, is that you can, say, completely redesign something. And when you're dealing with space as well, you know, more and more we've got access to put graphics and animated content on screens that become walls, that are projected over objects. And so I was playing around with that, and that's certainly like one of the advantages you can see. Just playing with ideas. Storytelling and space and Disneyland, and the cycle continues. You make something really large, and the first thing you want to do is stop making big stupid animations, and you want to do a couple of pictures, do a couple of sketches, find something you really like. And I'd always been obsessed with the kind of space of Pinocchio. In Italy, another place in Italy you can go is you can actually go to the place where the guy who wrote Pinocchio was born, and they've built the story of Pinocchio as a park. The original books were actually meant as these very short little fables, and they tied all the fables together to make the story of Pinocchio. But the idea with the original Pinocchio was that something would happen to Pinocchio in each issue of this magazine. It was like a little segment or an article, and at the end of each article, Pinocchio would die. He'd get killed. So there's these beautiful images of Pinocchio like hanging and stuff like that. So I guess when Walt came around to using Pinocchio, the story itself was kind of smoothed over so Pinocchio survived. But again, it was a series of these little moral tales. And when you watch the film, it's actually quite visually interesting. And I really liked it, but also liked the way that it was turned into a ride at Disneyland. So, and the visuals, and just the whole point about it being horribly dark. So I started rebuilding kind of shots. This is a photograph that I took inside the ride that I think is better than any of the 3D crap that I made. So shitty teeth there. But I fiddled around with it. So I started making overly kind of digitized kind of looking pieces and stuff like that. But I really like this idea that like hell and temptation and carnival sites are really intertwined. So you go to the carnival site, you go to this sort of place where you can do whatever you want and hit the hammer on the thing and bash this and do that and eat candy cane, but you're not supposed to go there. And it tied into a whole lot of stuff about America to do with like these fairgrounds being like shunned as the religious and historical views of the time changed. Parks turned from being utopias, places that were beautiful and wonderful, to being places that were dark and demonic. And so in Pinocchio, if you haven't seen it, watch it. But the kids get taken off to Pleasure Island. And on Pleasure Island, they can do whatever they want. Whatever they want. They can smoke cigars and drink and play pool all day. But they don't realise that bit by bit they're turning into donkeys. So I started to build almost like sites, like kind of, I played with the architecture, played with this idea that Pleasure Island could be like a place, but it was like a hybrid. And so I know, just steal and use the bits that I like and kind of build these kind of images out of it. A personal thing, if you like. Okay, so that was some work up to a particular point. Here's a bunch of commercial work that I did that takes a lot of what I'd sort of studied and experimented with and a lot of the technical skills to do with multiple projection, but just sensors about light and things like that I did. So the Melbourne Fringe Festival is this huge sort of festival in Melbourne. Takes place middle of the year if you were studying there. We always take a group. And they built a 7-screen, 5 by 4 metre screen setup hanging from the roof. It was a big old concert hall and it was too high. So they want people to come in and use the place like a bar, but the roof made you feel like you felt awkward in there. It was too high. So they built this tessellated kind of roof, and they got me to build kind of textured kind of patterns that moved across all the way to their bar, kind of leading you off to their bar. I get used a lot when shops or commercial ventures want to invade a new space. So at the moment I'm working on projections for a public site where they're about to demolish an existing building and build a new. So you know when you walk past a site and it says, coming soon, the Kristiansand life experience, the big poster. So I do a lot of projection work where they want to excite people about what a space could become. So this was a disused part of a shopping centre that they needed a 7-screen projection setup to kind of make it feel more interesting. So we built this sort of wraparound screen setup around this pop-up fashion store. This was a fashion store that wanted to kind of launch a new range. It's very dark there, but so they had this lovely little window that we covered over, and then we projected onto every single surface of the space. But a lot of the time they'd do that and then they'd launch it and they'd turn the lights on. You wouldn't be able to see anything. Live performance is always something you can do, but you could always just go home and turn the lights on and off. A lot of the time, especially live performance or VJing can sort of tend to be more you just making people trip and kind of have more fun. But it can also give you a lot of time to experiment graphically. In the same way you might sit on Photoshop or Illustrator or 3D. You can use a lot of software these days to quite quickly generate really interesting graphic kind of outcomes. So this is a theatre group. We went away for 2 weeks into the wilderness and sat in this hall, and I developed a set of animated backgrounds for their play, which we then performed, live triggered, and got it to react. So this was actually 4 sheets of kind of this amazing see-through kind of material. So if you stood in front of it, you got this sort of sense that these were ultra 3D kind of objects. Here was that they really wanted to bring the space alive over a particular evening, so we mapped all of these hideous kind of concrete shapes and had them kind of open out and display these kind of light effects and gold and stuff like that. And that's obviously something really common that's getting used a lot. Animators, with Blanc and stuff here in the town square, using existing architecture to build and projection map and change the way the space looks. So that's something that intersects with what I do really well. So there you can see a kind of transition, and it all depends on what your kind of life, where you are in your kind of creative life. But sometimes you want to be working to a brief, and other times you want to be kind of just sitting down and doing the research. But if you do the two, then you'll be more sought after in that other realm. So I did a bunch of illustrations that kind of had this sort of like, I don't know, Viking kind of look to them. And it caught the attraction of some guys that I'd met who'd formed an aging anthemic rock band, dress-up anthemic rock band called Barbarian, who have reached very high status in Melbourne. They all dress up as different mythological characters and then sort of perform. I think there's a picture of them here. Here we go. That gives you a bit of an idea. The whole idea was pyrotechnics, overblown kind of theatrics, and classic anthemic kind of rock and roll. They got me to create, they played in front of about 14,000 people and used these beautiful LED screens. And they got me to kind of create both visuals, but also like text typography to follow their lyrics, which are very easy to sing along to. I'll play a little clip of that in here, which you can check out later. But LED screens compared to projection screens, it's a beautiful, beautiful thing. This light that exists within the surface. It's just like enormous screens. That's the clip that you can check out. So working with bands, working with corporate kind of people, all really to the same idea, multiple screens, spaces, that sort of things. I did some sort of single channel works with a bit more flame that were kind of inspired by the band. This was a work that I made for a fundraiser for a Japanese tsunami that went into a collection that you can actually get hold of. I was really interested in, because I guess working with those guys, but also playing around with like the space that exists in video and film footage. I've been experimenting and playing around with software that will allow you to take historic or video photographs and then build 3D shapes from them. It's fairly common, I guess, now for sort of grabbing 3D objects from existing photography. But you can make what I call a point cloud, where you can get 3D data from any kind of content that you've got multiple photographs of. And it's the same idea that's used for motion tracking. So I played around a bit by rebuilding the video clip for Guns N' Roses' November Rain, but making flame come out of his guitar and then sort of making the sky kind of go red and things like that. So I was just sort of toying around with how you might be able to go back to an old piece of footage and sort of reinvent it. The last project before I came to Norway, and I'll kind of end on this piece, where through my PhD, so my doctoral kind of work, you still, even if you do that kind of study, you still get to do really fun stuff, and the focus is still on making pictures, making illustrations, and making videos. But I picked 3 sites that I thought were interesting as I went back to try and find out about the real history of the dark ride. So the cool thing about looking at fairgrounds is there's always awesome images, and I found this image of this fairground from 1901. And this is the earliest recorded example of a Dantes Inferno ride. So we looked at a couple earlier. And I thought, well, that just looks bloody sick. But what the hell was it? So you go back through history books and try and find out kind of what happened. And it's very, very hard. And I've travelled to New York and gone through like libraries of files. I can tell you how much it cost to get into this pavilion. I can tell you how well the candy store around the corner did. But I can't tell you what happened when you went inside that ride. And I will. But I started to imagine and to 3D model. I found as many photographs as I could. I found side views, front views, whatever I could, but only a limited amount. And I started to sort of try to get my modelling a bit up to speed. I also found examples of other illustrations of Dante in history that seemed to in some way relate to it. And this is a guy named, I forget, but anyway, it's a beautiful picture. And that was made in 1700s, so there's clearly some relationship between the way that people think about Dante and, again, this idea of being ingested and eaten and swallowed and stuff. So I remade the ride as a sort of 3D model, which I think is fairly good. I don't know, don't criticise me right now, but again, this wasn't sort of my area of exacting 3D modelling, but I then you do it out of an obsession. It's great because you want to model it, you want to bring it back to life, and then you've got to work out what to do with it. So I used it in a bunch of different ways, rebuilding some parts of the actual fairground, and that was one example, and later I'll show you some physical 3D models. So that was one, these were just like favourite places, if you like. So it was like Joel's postcards of his favourite places from history, rebuilt. This is the first film ever to use a moving camera, and it's a film called Cabiria. It's an Italian film. And it's sort of like a precursor to Indiana Jones, 1911, so really, really early. And so I thought in my head that this Dantes Inferno ride, that's going to come in useful later. I'm going to start researching that. Cabiria, this film, with these sick environments, that's going to come in useful. So I'll look at that. And so I rebuilt some of those shots as sort of my own. And this was an example of the head of that kind of figure from there. I used a lot of sort of dynamics to decorate the scenes, still playing around with my sort of planks and logs and bits, because I was still really concerned and interested in this idea that, these forgotten spaces would be just sort of covered in detritus, or, that they'd be left among the ruins. And for the 3D people, using a lot of sort of dynamics with simple objects to just sort of throw detritus all over the work was really useful. And so, but I also played around with it just on its own, just sort of creating structures of rubbish. But all they are is just planks. And again, going through this sort of work, finding examples of these rides, trying to figure out, a lot of the work then became more about finding out what the hell the ride was actually like more than when it was. And this is an example of a ride that was torn down just 2 years ago in Panama City, Florida, in a place called Miracle Strip. And that became the name of this show, where these 3 sites were investigated. And it's cool looking at a more contemporary site because you could actually, this is a YouTube clip of someone just before the park shut down. So instead of trying to look back through history to find like 2 or 3 photographs of a site, you could actually go to YouTube and someone would be like, hey, Granny, thing. And you just get little bits of footage, like of different weird angles of the site. So it made modelling it strange, but it also meant that you were kind of collecting people's memories, because at no point did anybody archive or photograph any of this stuff for posterity. But people archive stuff all the time. And I'm really interested to work on more projects where I rebuild things that people have experienced. And today you can imagine YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Flickr. You can access images of what places look like far more than they are archived in reality. And so I rebuilt that as that and that. And then build an entire show out of all of these different types of images. So this was a projection that we did into the front window of the gallery, and then behind that we had a bunch of the sculptured kind of work. So that would change through the night, showing you these different sort of images really big, and then we'd have them really small. So these were, you can get 3D objects modeled. These are about that big. So they're quite small on the table, but they look big there. So from 3D models you can get different sorts of substances made. This was quite nice. It was like a combination of stone or chalk and plastic, so it gave them a kind of sandstone kind of look to it, which is really nice. Because normally when you 3D model something, you get a kind of see-through, waxy look to it. That is it. What I've been researching since I got here has been these different examples, trying to nut out when the hell rides in the dark happened. And the one that keeps popping up is this ride called A Trip to the Moon, which is 1901. And these are like illustrations, not the real thing. But it was a ride that basically happened at a fair at the turn of the century. And you can go to the patent online. You can actually go and look at what they patented when they made it. And so the idea is you'd sit in this big boat, and then these wings would flap. And then you'd look out of, that's just an illustration, you look out of the boat, and these monsters would pop up and they'd turn lights on and different things. So that was Trip to the Moon, and then around that same time, two rides, one in England, one in America, popped up. River Caves and this old mill. Thank you.